If our demands are not fulfilled, what should we do? We have to sleep on the side of the road. We have to die on the side of the road. We have nothing. We don't have a house, nothing to eat. We don't have food to eat. Everything was swept away by the flood.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on over 30 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org. We begin in New Haven, where the campaign against the Wells Fargo Bank is meeting with some success. The mayor of New Haven has agreed in principle to take money, city money, out of the Wells Fargo Bank. New Haven activists are keeping up the pressure, though, including this rally in front of City Hall.
Boycott! Wells Fargo! Boycott! Wells Fargo! Boycott! Wells Fargo!
I just want to talk a little bit about what happened, what the significance of what happened at Standing Rock. It was the first time in 150 years that the 7 tribes of the Sioux Nation had got together again in a common goal. In September, when I went out there, I took part in a ceremony that brought 2 of their chanupas, which chanupas are their pipes. It's their most sacred item. They brought 2 of their chanupas together. One was the 1865 treaty pipe, and the other was the White Buffalo pipe. The White Buffalo pipe goes back 22 generations. So the combining of that was a very sacred and special ceremony. During the time I was there, another, like 200 to 300 tribal nations came in and joined in solidarity with what was happening there. And I'm sure most of you must know, that they were driving this pipeline through tribal territory illegally. They hadn't done the environmental studies that they were supposed to do, and they hadn't kept the tribe informed of what was happening there, and they did it without permission of the Standing Rock tribe. So that's why there were so many people. That's why it was so big. That's why it garnered so much support from not only from here but from around the world. So the reason why we're targeting Wells Fargo here in New Haven is because Wells Fargo is funded the DAPL pipeline to the tune of $467 million. And our city does business with it.
So some of you might have seen the headline, right? The mayor commits to pulling money out of Wells Fargo. In truth, yes, they're starting to move the money, little bits of money, but there is no firm commitment to do, to pull all the money out. And so that's why we're here. That's why we're going to keep pushing. It's because they need to make that full commitment. We want the mayor's office to make a public commitment to pull the money out by a reasonable deadline, and we'll continue to negotiate with them on that. But we know it's feasible. They just have to put in the work to figure that out. So when I say Mayor Harp, I want you to say, move the money. Mayor Harp,
Move the money!
Mayor Harp,
Move the money!
Mayor Harp,
Move the money!
All right.
So one of the fiduciary responsibilities we have as citizens is to follow the dollars, especially in the case of public dollars. When we do that, the list of reasons why Wells Fargo is not a secure, moral, or trustworthy repository for New Haven's money is long, very long. Prominent on that list of reasons, in addition to ones we already know, is the role that Wells Fargo has played in financing the debts of two private prison industry leaders in this country, GEO Group and the Corrections Corporation of America, CCA, which has been recently rebranded about a year ago as Core Civic. Now, how do we know about Wells Fargo's role in this? Well, in 2016, the nonprofit research and policy organization In the Public Interest issued a report entitled "The Banks That Finance Private Prison Companies." Guess who was one of those banks?
Wells Fargo.
Right, Wells Fargo. The report documents Wells Fargo's history of complicity with GEO Group and CCA in, and I quote, profiting from mass incarceration and the criminalization of immigration.
So yeah, I just wanted to go into some more specifics because we all know that Wells Fargo funded the Dakota Access Pipeline to the tune of $467 million, but they also have quite a history of funding fossil fuel projects in addition to that. There was a report that was put out recently. It's called Banking on Climate Change. It was put out by Rainforest Action Network, Greenpeace USA, and a host of other renowned environmental organizations. And in that report, they graded various banks based on how much money they've given to fossil fuel projects. So Wells Fargo graded a B- for coal mining, so not terrible with coal mining. Then it graded a D for coal fuel power plants, a D+ for extreme oil projects. That includes like Arctic drilling, tar sands, things like that. A D- for natural gas exports. So not doing so well there. Overall, it ranks number 20 in the list of the 37 multinational banks that were profiled as putting the most money into fossil fuel projects.
I'm just going to wrap up at the end, but just before we do that, the other way that people can make a difference is by pulling your own personal finances out of these banks. And I'm just going to ask Stan Heller to just briefly say what he did.
At the rally, I put down the camcorder and talk about what my wife and I did when we saw standing rock water protectors doused with freezing water. We made up this sign, closed our Wells Fargo bank account, and took a selfie out in front of the bank. The whole thing took us about a half hour and got a lot of attention. After the speeches, there was a march to the Wells Fargo Bank and then back again to City Hall, where more petitions were brought to the mayor's office.
Boycott! Wells Fargo! Boycott! Wells Fargo! Boycott! Wells Fargo! Boycott! Wells Fargo! Wells Fargo! Wells Fargo! Wells Fargo!
The mayor's staff is kindly going to make copies of the originals that we brought. So we'll give the mayor the originals and we'll have our copies. And then we can continue, I think we should continue to gather signatures. Boycott!
Wells Fargo!
Boycott!
Wells Fargo!
Boycott!
Wells Fargo!
Boycott!
Wells Fargo!
Remember, this is not just a fight about what the pipelines are doing to Native American land. We have a desperate need to stop burning fossil fuel. At the rally, I mentioned some very disturbing news from an article on August 23rd in the New York Times. It was headlined, "In Alaska, the permafrost is thawing." The permafrost has trapped within it enormous, vast amounts of carbon dioxide. Long ago, it was plant matter that froze before it could decompose and give off carbon dioxide. But now that permafrost is warming. The article states estimates vary on how much carbon is currently released from thawing permafrost worldwide. But by one calculations, emissions over the rest of the century could average 1.5 billion tons a year. Now that number should be alarming because it's just about the same amount of carbon dioxide that the U.S. sends into the atmosphere every year. It makes it even more critical that we do our utmost to stop the burning of fossil fuels, keep the oil in the soil. Now to reports about flooding, first in Texas, but then to the even more deadly flooding in Southeast Asia.
Well, the National Hurricane Center is now calling Harvey the biggest rainstorm on record. It's not come as a complete surprise. Scientists have been predicting for years climate change could result in massive storms like Harvey. Climate scientist Michael Mann wrote this. Quote, Harvey was almost certainly more intense than it would have been in the absence of human-caused warming, which means stronger winds, more wind damage, and a larger storm surge. We go now to Houston to speak with Robert Bullard, known as the father of environmental justice, currently a distinguished professor at Texas Southern University. He's the former director of the Environmental Justice Resource Center at Clark Atlanta University. We're reaching Dr. Bullard from his home in Houston, which he needs to evacuate later this morning due to the rising Brazos River. Professor Bullard, thanks so much for being with us. Can you talk about the situation you're in and so many people in Houston are in right now? Describe the scene for us, and then how you relate it to your life's work, to the issue of climate change and environmental justice.
Well, good morning, and thanks for having me. Harvey and the aftermath, the flooding of Houston and the surrounding areas, it's of biblical proportion. This is a nightmare, and the images that you see on television, and you hear the voices of people who have been just totally destroyed, and this is a situation where I think it's telling us that we have to change. We have to change the way we do business and the way that we, as humans, interact with our environment. And this is basically the situation where this storm, this flooding of this city, tells us that there's no place that's immune from devastation. I worked, in New Orleans and the flooding after Katrina. New Orleans was only 500,000 people. Houston is 2.3 million people. And then you look at the surrounding areas, you're talking 5.5 or almost 6 million people. And so you talk about this devastation, it is of historic proportion.
And Dr. Bullard, to what degree do you think unchecked development by Houston's officials over the past several decades has created an even worse possibility for calamity when a natural disaster like this hits?
Well, Houston was a catastrophe waiting to happen. Given the fact you have unrestrained capitalism, no zoning, laissez-faire, regulations when it comes to control of the very industries that have created lots of problems when it comes to greenhouse gases and other industrial pollution, the impact that basically has been ignored for many years. And so the fact that this is, it is a disaster, but it's a very predictable disaster. And those communities that historically have borne the burden of environmental pollution and contamination from these many industries, at the same time, are the very communities that are bearing disproportionately the burden of this flooding. And so you get this pre-existing condition of inequality before the storm, and this inequality in terms of how people are able to address this disaster because of vulnerability. And I think what we have to do is look at some lessons, well, not learned from Katrina in terms of the rebuilding, redevelopment, and recovery.
And there's been quite a bit of second guessing of Mayor Sylvester Turner's decision not to call for an evacuation of the city. I'm wondering your take on that, especially given what happened with Hurricane, was it Rita a couple of years ago, when there was an evacuation effort made, but more people ended up dying, about 100 people in the gridlock that occurred as people tried to leave a city as large as Houston's.
Well, it's easy to second guess, but the fact is that trying to evacuate, 2.3 million people on these highways is almost a task that's impossible. And so I don't think, there was anything that you can say, well, why is it that the mayor and the county judge decided to go this way? When you look at the problems of logistics and trying to, move this many people, on these highways, getting out of the city, that probably was not, a good choice to make. And so I think the decision to have people shelter in place, and no one could predict, what happened afterward. And so I think the best that we can do now, instead of pointing fingers, is pointing to solutions and pointing to way that we can address the many problems and challenges that we face today. And having to evacuate and leave your home and go out there and not know what's ahead of you. I mean, you have your life, and I'm blessed. And that when you see those images, you can see that this is pain. And I think all government officials and governmental agencies and voluntary associations and civic groups and faith groups, we have to come together and make sure that we do what's right and not what's politically expedient, but do what's right and make sure that we build, a just and healthy and sustainable city when we rebuild and when we recover. It has to be.
Before we go to another Democracy Now! Report, this time about flooding overseas, we mentioned the Greenexpo coming up in New Haven on September 9th. If you go, be sure to stop by the table of Promoting Enduring Peace.
While Houston remains underwater after a historic storm, we turn now to look at massive flooding across the globe in South Asia. Over the past month, more than 1,200 people have died amidst flooding in Bangladesh, Nepal, and India. This year's monsoon season has brought torrential downpours that have submerged wide swaths of South Asia, destroying tens of thousands of homes, schools, and hospitals, and affecting up to 40 million people. Flood victims in southern Nepal say they have lost everything.
If our demands are not fulfilled, what should we do? We have to sleep on the side of the road. We have to die on the side of the road. We have nothing. We don't have a house, nothing to eat. We don't have food to eat. Everything was swept away by the flood.
Aid organizations are warning this is one of the worst regional humanitarian crises in years, with millions of people facing severe food shortages and disease caused by polluted floodwater. We go now to London to speak with Asad Rehman, who is Executive Director of War on Want. He's worked on climate change issues for over a decade. Asad, welcome back to Democracy Now! We usually see you at the UN climate summits. Talk about, let's take one country, Bangladesh. A third of Bangladesh is underwater. Can you talk about how many people have died just in the last few weeks there and the significance of what is happening now in this region and its connection to two words you almost never hear? I'm not only talking about Fox, but on MSNBC and CNN as they cover the devastation in Houston almost 24 hours a day. And those two words, of course, climate change or climate chaos or climate disruption.
Well, thank you, Amy, and thank you for the invitation to join you. Yeah, absolutely. When you look at the devastating pictures, of course, now, as we've seen in the United States, the pictures that are emerging from right across the region in Nepal and India and Bangladesh are absolutely devastating. In Bangladesh, 1/3 of the country is underwater. Millions of people are being affected. I mean, hundreds of people have lost their lives, but we are still waiting to see what an accurate count will be. I spoke to somebody earlier in Bangladesh who told me that there are still communities that are cut off. The similar story as the account that you heard in Nepal, people without food, without access to fresh water. I mean, it sounds like a slightly, how could the flooding mean that the people don't have access to fresh water? But the flooding has meant that fresh water wells are all polluted, people don't have access to fresh water, and of course people are losing their livelihoods and every part of their valuables. And we're talking about a country where 50% of the population is below the poverty line, where the per capita income of Bangladesh is about $1,500. And if you compare that to an average US citizen, which is about $55,000. And of course, there is inequalities in the United States, but we're talking about some of the most poorest and most vulnerable people. And of course, Bangladesh is uniquely vulnerable to flooding because of its geography. It's a low-lying basin. But what you've heard continuously is that the monsoon rains are becoming more intense, stronger, and more devastating year upon year. And this is for two reasons. One, as temperatures increase and we're seeing warming across the globe, the glaciers and the snow melt are swelling rivers as they come through down from the Himalayas, through Nepal, India, and into Bangladesh, where they go into the sea. At the same time, warming temperatures in the sea means that there's more moisture in the atmosphere, which means more intense and heavier rains. Now, this is not something new. Climate scientists have been telling us and have predicted what would be happening, that these kind of storms, these intensity of storms, which used to happen every few hundred years, would happen much more regularly and every decade, and now become literally an annual thing. The problem is, of course, is the ability of people and the government to be able to respond. When you have these floods which wipe away infrastructure, schools, hospitals, roads, it's very, very hard to rebuild. And of course, these are countries which have had and do have flood systems when those are overwhelmed. Now, if in the United States, which is a country with, I think it's about $18.5 trillion global GDP every year, in Bangladesh, it's only about 220 billion. So the ability of these poor countries who are most vulnerable to be able to continuously rebuild, to be able to protect their citizens, is of course severely limited. And these impacts are of course not only going to be felt today, they are going to be felt tomorrow and the days and the weeks and the months after. Because for many of the people who are subsistence farmers, people who rely on their crop to both feed their families and to be able to sell some to be able to survive the year, most of them have lost their crops already. Much of the food production in one of the most important basins, the Ganges Basin, is one of the bread baskets, of food baskets of the region. And this and the Indus basket have both been impacted severely by climate impacts and are predicted to get even worse in the coming years.
The floods come just weeks after researchers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology published a report saying soaring temperatures could make parts of South Asia too hot for human survival by 2100. The MIT researchers concluded as many as 1.5 billion people living in areas that could become uninhabitable during summer heat waves within only 83 years if climate change continues at its current pace. India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh would be the worst affected areas. In 2015, some 3,500 people died in the heat wave that struck India and Pakistan. As Asad, as you look at the images of Houston, the U.S.'s fourth largest city, and you look at what's happening in your region of the world, in South Asia, final thoughts on what you feel needs to happen as President Trump today goes to Texas, the leading climate denier in the United States, who's pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement?
Well, as you said, the MIT report simply builds on what climate scientists have already told us, that South Asia will be one of the most vulnerable regions in the world. And as you said, 1.5 billion people. Scientists are predicting up to 70% of the population will be directly impacted by climate impacts. The drought, the heat wave that you talked about, that was at 49.5 degrees centigrade. Earlier this year in May, Pakistan recorded a temperature level of 51 degrees centigrade. Now, for the majority of people who have to spend long hours out in the open as farmers, this is simply intolerable. People cannot survive out in the open. So the implications and the impacts that we're talking about will be absolutely devastating. And they're devastating now, and they're likely to get much, much worse. And of course, the economic impacts are also devastating. For a region which is one of the poorest regions of the world, climate scientists have said that just the impacts in terms of GDP will be running in the region of hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, when I look at the pictures in Houston when I look at the pictures of Houston, I hope that Donald Trump, I understand he's going to Texas, probably he'd be better going to Paris, Texas, and he may be better going there and recognizing that the culpability of him, of the fossil fuel industry that back him, of deliberately turning their back on climate change, on deliberately turning their back on taking action on climate change is not only culpable for the impacts that are happening in Houston, but happening all around the world. The window is closing, action is needed now, and really, Donald Trump needs to wake up and smell the roses.
Asad Rehman, I want to thank you for being with us. Executive Director of War on Want, has worked on climate change issues for over a decade, speaking to us from London. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Before I go, I want to mention a stunning article by Nick Kristof in the New York Times, photos the Saudi Arabians don't want you to see. We'll link to it at thestruggle.org, and it also is at saudius.org. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.